In 1962, Brian Epstein walked into my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name.
George Martin was the one who paved the way for the Beatles to enter their own creative territory. He not only shaped the way they recorded and organized ideas, but also pioneered techniques that allowed the band to move beyond the boundaries of 1960s pop music. Along that journey, Paul McCartney was the one Martin was most closely connected with, a perfectionist, controlling, and always proposing bold ideas. Although Martin participated in hundreds of recording sessions, he rarely spoke publicly about the personal bond between him and McCartney. What we know mostly comes from studio notes, indirect accounts, or scattered behind-the-scenes footage. Behind their iconic collaborative relationship were countless disagreements, adjustments, and compromises. Martin once described himself as McCartney's musical translator, but the relationship was always more complex than it appeared. That story began on June 6, 1962, at the EMI studios on Abbey Road in London, where the Beatles had their first recording audition. George Martin, then a producer at Parlophone, a small division of EMI, was tasked with evaluating the young band from Liverpool. Though he was not entirely won over by the initial recording, he quickly noticed one member, Paul McCartney, who displayed unusual initiative and perceptiveness. While John Lennon remained cautious and George Harrison was relatively quiet, McCartney actively conversed with the technicians, asking questions about recording techniques and emphasizing ideas related to harmony and orchestration. To Martin, who was used to having full control over the production process, this was unfamiliar. He saw in McCartney a mind full of ideas but lacking direction and not easily persuaded. From the beginning, disagreements emerged around song selection. Martin did not think highly of Love Me Do, believing its structure was too simple, while McCartney firmly defended it. In the end, the recording was adjusted to Martin's preferences, the tempo was shortened, and the harmonica part was pushed to the beginning. Surprisingly, the released version charted, prompting both sides to reconsider their views of each other. One of Martin's earliest and most pivotal interventions was suggesting the replacement of drummer Pete Best with Ringo Starr. Though not an easy decision, Martin believed they needed someone who could blend musically and personally in the studio. McCartney, initially resistant, eventually agreed. This decision laid the foundation for a more stable group dynamic and demonstrated Martin's willingness to make difficult decisions for the band's long-term benefit. During early sessions, Martin often wrote personal impressions after each recording. Some notes specifically referenced McCartney, praising his musical control, work ethic, and maturity beyond his years. Martin would later reflect, "Paul was the only one who made me explain why an idea wouldn't work." Their early collaboration was marked by frequent clashes, over tempo, key, and recording techniques, but it was through these conflicts that each began to appreciate the other's capabilities. McCartney did not simply submit to Martin, he listened. Martin, in turn, did not back down, but always offered technical reasoning instead of emotional argument. Their relationship wasn't built on similarity or personal closeness but on the ability to coexist with differences. As trust grew, their roles became clearer, less a struggle for control and more a collaboration based on complementary strengths, leading to an unprecedented creative era in popular music. Between 1965 and 1967, at the height of their harmony, the Beatles entered a phase of unmatched creativity. Albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, and especially Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band transformed them from a performing band into pioneers of studio artistry. During this time, the bond between McCartney and Martin evolved into a unique collaboration defined not by hierarchy, but by a seamless fusion of imagination and technical skill. McCartney no longer simply brought melodies to the studio. He arrived with complete visions, ideas for orchestration, harmonic textures, and a full sonic experience. Rather than restraining this enthusiasm, Martin translated McCartney's abstract concepts into concrete production strategies. A perfect example was Eleanor Rigby. Originally a simple folk tune, Martin proposed eliminating all traditional instruments, replacing them with an 8-piece string ensemble. He arranged the opening in the style of Bartók, no harmony, no background layers, producing a recording that felt cinematic and concise, with no drums or guitar. Martin didn't just realize ideas, he refined and shaped them. On For No One, though McCartney recorded almost everything himself, Martin insisted on adding a French horn to balance the tone. When McCartney hesitated, Martin sketched out an arrangement and brought in Alan Civil from the London Symphony Orchestra, who completed it in just 4 takes. Martin believed boundaries protected the essence of a song from becoming overindulgent. A Day in the Life was another landmark. Its dual structure, Lennon's segment and McCartney's interlude, was preserved, but Martin proposed linking them with a dramatic orchestral crescendo using a 40-piece ensemble playing a gradual build-up across 24 bars in semi-random fashion. The session was theatrical. Musicians wore suits and face paint, masks, and hats, and Martin managed the volume and tape to stretch the final chord nearly a minute without distortion. During this era, Martin and McCartney functioned as the dual poles of a creative engine, one asking, "What if?" and the other testing ideas through technical precision. Of course, disagreements remained. When McCartney suggested using reverse tape on Rain, Martin didn't reject the idea but insisted on a comparison test. McCartney agreed, and the reversed sound was incorporated at the track's end. Not everything ran smoothly. McCartney often brought in drafts that were too complex or ill-timed. Sometimes he scribbled chords on a napkin and demanded quick orchestration. Martin didn't refuse but set strict terms. If time was limited, the orchestration had to be scaled down. Their relationship became a model of creative tension balanced by mutual respect, where spontaneity was refined through discipline. But as the Beatles' internal dynamics shifted, cracks began to form. The White Album, recorded over nearly 6 months, marked the beginning of a silent dissolution. With 30 stylistically diverse tracks, many developed in isolation, George Martin was no longer the unifying producer. He was increasingly pushed aside, working with individual members in fragmented sessions. McCartney, trying to maintain momentum, took greater control, bringing in finished arrangements, playing multiple instruments himself, even using a different engineer when Martin wasn't present. Some tracks, like Martha My Dear, were recorded entirely without other Beatles. Martin, though outwardly calm, felt the strain. In one interview he sighed, "They were no longer a band, and I was no longer the producer." Tensions peaked during these sessions. Veteran engineer Geoff Emerick quit mid-project after McCartney demanded a complete redo of a bass track without Lennon or Harrison present. Feeling disrespected and under pressure, Emerick walked out. Martin didn't stop him. He saw it as evidence of a fractured collaboration. Creative disputes, management issues, and personal conflicts collided in the studio. McCartney, trying to hold everything together, increasingly acted like a solo artist in a fragmented system where Martin's role had diminished. One revealing moment came when McCartney brought a new version of Obla Di, Obla Da, and requested a total overhaul. Lennon disliked the song entirely, and Martin remained quiet. Then Lennon, without warning, walked into the studio, sat at the piano, and played the opening in a new style. McCartney accepted it instantly, and Martin finalized the track in one session, a rare flash of spontaneous unity in a tense environment. After the White Album, Martin was mostly absent from the Let It Be sessions, which were handed over to a different team. When the project fell apart, Phil Spector was brought in to salvage it. McCartney agreed, wanting to see it finished, but was outraged by the final mix. He thought Spector's strings on The Long and Winding Road were excessive and unfaithful. Furious, McCartney called Martin and said, "I no longer recognize my own song." Martin replied calmly, "You gave it to someone else, Paul." It was one of the rare moments where George Martin's quiet dignity exposed the painful reality. The creative bond that had built one of history's most influential musical legacies had frayed, not from failure, but from too much brilliance, pulled in too many directions. George Martin openly expressed his opinion about a product he did not directly oversee. Even so, he did not criticize anyone, nor did he try to reclaim his former role. He stayed away from projects related to the Beatles, not out of resentment, but because he understood the boundary between what belonged to him and what had ended. While no one could be certain whether the relationship between him and McCartney could ever be repaired, one thing was clear. When the name The Beatles no longer bound them, they found common ground once again, this time as two independent artists. It was a timeless connection between two souls. In 1970, when the Beatles officially disbanded, not only did the band come to an end, but many relationships also closed their chapters. However, between George Martin and Paul McCartney, the collaboration did not cease, it merely changed form. They continued to work together on other projects, no longer influenced by the machinery of the band and free from the internal pressure or the underlying power structures that once existed during the Beatles era. Their relationship had now become an encounter between two mature individuals, each playing a distinct role in a creative process without constraints. A major milestone came in 1973 when McCartney was invited to compose the theme song for Live and Let Die, one of the most successful entries in the James Bond franchise. He personally invited George Martin to produce the title track. This marked the first official collaboration between the two since Abbey Road. Without Lennon, without Harrison, and outside the familiar Abbey Road studio, the setting had changed, but their roles remained intact. McCartney brought in a melody with a completed chorus, while Martin handled the orchestration, organized a large-scale ensemble, and created smooth transitions between contrasting musical sections. The recording stood out not only among previous Bond songs, but also came to be regarded as a pinnacle in 1970s film music. From there, a new chapter began. In the 1980s, as McCartney searched for direction after the Wings era, Martin, now in his 50s, maintained his meticulous working style, checking every orchestral detail, every downbeat. The two joined forces on Tug of War, 1982, followed by Pipes of Peace, 1983. In an environment free of the tension that once existed during the Beatles' years, their working process flowed smoothly, almost reviving the ideal model of collaboration they had once hoped for. At this point, Martin was not merely the man behind the control desk. He actively contributed ideas for shaping the album's concept, selecting tracks, and suggesting guest artists. For Tug of War, it was he who proposed inviting Stevie Wonder to collaborate on What's That You're Doing? A bold surprise demonstrating his willingness to broaden the scope of collaboration. Knowing that McCartney had placed full trust in him, the album was later regarded as McCartney's most outstanding work since the Beatles, and once again, Martin was part of that success. Between them, there was no friendship in the conventional sense. They did not frequently appear together or share personal matters in public. Still, those close to them recounted that they stayed in touch through handwritten letters or phone calls. Giles Martin, George's son, once shared, "My father had a shelf dedicated to Paul's demo tapes, not to store them, but because it made him happy knowing Paul was still writing." Even though they no longer worked together regularly, George Martin always expressed a special respect for McCartney in interviews. When asked who had taught him the most throughout his career, he answered without hesitation, "Paul. He always knew exactly what he wanted. My challenge was to find a way to make that happen within realistic limits and frameworks." In an industry where clashes between creativity and production are commonplace, the decades-long collaboration between Martin and McCartney was a rare exception. It was not based on friendship nor on loyalty, but sustained by mutual respect, each person fully aware of their role and careful not to overstep into the other's domain. When George Martin passed away, McCartney did not hold a grand memorial. But through what he shared, it is clear that Martin's role went far beyond the boundaries of a producer, a quiet echo from the one who remained. On March 8, 2016, George Martin passed away, concluding a life that spanned a full 90 years. In his first statement following the sad news, Paul McCartney wrote briefly but meaningfully, "He was a true gentleman, a genius of the studio, and a second father to me." The message was not long, but carried deep weight. For in more than half a century of working together, McCartney had rarely offered such personal, heartfelt words to anyone, especially those who had shared in his professional life. Shortly after, McCartney held a private memorial at a small chapel in Oxfordshire. There were no media cameras, no speeches, only a piano, a few close friends, and one unreleased recording played at the end. It was a demo recorded in 1981, edited by George Martin himself. The handwritten note on the outside simply read, "Unfinished but honest enough." From that moment on, Martin's name appeared more often in McCartney's interviews, not in the form of worn-out praise, but as a quiet point of reference. Whenever speaking about orchestration, arrangements, or recording techniques, McCartney often recalled things Martin had taught him, from how to balance electronic instruments with acoustic ones, to using silence as a structural element in music. When recounting moments when Martin rejected a proposal, he did not emphasize the disagreement, but highlighted the consideration that sometimes Martin simply needed more time to reevaluate the matter. To Paul, Martin was not someone who had passed. He was more like a system of thought that Paul still reflected upon in each new work. In a conversation with Giles Martin in 2022, McCartney confided that he still hears George's voice when composing, "Sometimes I want to add a string section at the end of a song. And in my head I hear the question, are you doing this for the song or to prove something?" According to him, questions like that serve as a compass to keep music from descending into meaningless showmanship. That presence became even clearer when McCartney faced new musical technologies. As artificial intelligence began being used to recreate the voices and styles of deceased artists, he was among the first to speak out about ethical boundaries. During a 2023 hearing at the UK Parliament, he stated, "The real voice isn't in the frequency. It's in the context, in the moment, and in the relationship with the listener." When a reporter asked whether George Martin could be brought back using AI, McCartney shook his head. "No way. We used to sit together for hours in silence. No machine understands the meaning of those silences." Some handwritten documents released by Martin's family after his death also revealed thoughts he had never spoken aloud. In one undated note, Martin wrote, "Paul is not easy to work with. But that very insecurity kept me from being careless. If he was too demanding, it was because he didn't want to lose what the music was waiting for." In another shorter note, Martin left the line, "I orchestrated the process, but he brought the reason for that process to exist." There was no formal farewell, no final letter. But in every small reaction McCartney showed when mentioning Martin, and in every page of Martin's notes about McCartney, one could recognize a relationship that needed no emotional climax. It was sustained by enduring professional standards. The bond between Paul McCartney and George Martin was not simply a friendship, nor just a relationship between artist and producer. It was a symbiosis between two value systems, one representing the boundless spirit of the artist, the other a symbol of structure and control. Though they clashed, paused, and sometimes worked apart, they never denied each other's role in the creative journey. And when only one of them continued that path, the other's presence still remained, as an unchanging standard for how a song should be made.